Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Ha-yen-doh-nees' collection, Seneca Indian Stories. So Ha-yen-doh-nees, or Lee Cooper, was a Seneca. He was not a professional author, but he determined to transmit the oral stories of his people, the Seneca, in written form so that they could be preserved better. He was born in New York State, Carrolltown, New York, in the Allegheny Reservation, part of the Bear Clan, I believe. Sorry, Heron Clan. There's discussion of the Bear Clan in some of the stories, and I think that's sort of put that in my mind. So I was raised in Rochester, New York. That's my hometown. Rochester is traditional Seneca territory. The Seneca, of course, part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. More commonly called the Iroquois, but I tend to avoid that term because my understanding of the etymology is that Iroquois is a French corruption of an Algonquian word that is a not particularly flattering or positive description of the Haudenosaunee. And Haudenosaunee is what they referred to themselves as a collective confederation, meaning something like people of the Longhouse. And the Seneca were one of the nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederation. And again, I grew up in what had traditionally, prior to settler colonialists largely driving the Seneca and the Haudenosaunee off of their lands, what had been Seneca territory. And so these would be traditional stories told in the part of the world where I was raised, not by my people, but by the people who we more or less stole that territory from. So I think these are really, really cool stories. They're really, really fascinating, in part because what they do seems quite simple on the surface, but actually has these layers of complexity. So the stories are essentially fables. And they are meant to do what fables are meant to do, right? So fables, if you think about any tradition of fables, Aesop being perhaps the most famous in Western culture, but any tradition of fables from around the world, they have an explanatory function. They set out to generally explain something. So, for instance, how the rabbit came to have long ears and long hind legs explains that. Now, of course, the explanation, as we know, based on modern biology and evolution, etc., is complete nonsense, but that really isn't the point. This is a species of mythology in that it has this explanatory function, but that's not really central to what the fable is supposed to do. That's a sort of secondary purpose, to explain a natural phenomenon. The much more important purpose is to teach some moral lesson. So, in that example, for instance, how the rabbit came to have long ears and long hind legs, the moral lesson is basically that rabbit had been eavesdropping on other creatures' conversations, and then going around and gossiping. And the Great Spirit, or Ha-yen-doh, probably pronouncing that wrong, I apologize if I am. I'm trying to work from the sort of phonetic right there. But if you speak Seneca, if you speak the Seneca language, which would be awesome. I'd love to hear from you in the comments about how to actually pronounce this. But the Great Spirit is displeased with this. And so because Rabbit refuses or doesn't comply with leaving people, and I'm going to say people, but I mean people and creatures here, because in many indigenous traditions, including that of the Haudenosaunee, there's humans and there's flora and fauna and spirit world, all of which have the same moral authority. And so people in this case is not intended to designate human beings as such, but intended to designate all creatures, all beings that have moral authority or moral agency. So human beings, plants, animals, spirits, etc. All of that comprehensively regarded as one unified ethical whole in many indigenous cultures. So the Great Spirit wants Rabbit to leave others their privacy. Rabbit does not comply with this, and so as punishment, the Great Spirit stretches out Rabbit's ears and hind legs so that it will be harder for Rabbit to hide in the bush, because his ears will stand up and be visible, and so people can see him and not have secret conversations while he's around. And his long feet mean he has to hop, which will draw attention to him. So if he is spotted eavesdropping and then flees, everyone will know that it was him, right? So that's the ultimate purpose of the fable, is to teach a moral lesson about why it's wrong to eavesdrop and to gossip. So these are stories intended to promote positive behaviors. And they are very traditional stories. This is an incredibly important component of this. This is an oral tradition that no one, of course, knows for sure with an oral tradition how far back in time it goes. But what in this sort of prefatory story, How the Crow Got His Black Clothes, Ha-yen-doh-nees reflects on this. My father told us many stories years ago where we were children growing up on this reservation. His father had told him the stories, and his father before him. Nobody wrote them down because the Senecas didn't have reading and writing then. They depended on remembering things, storing them in their heads so that they could be told and enjoyed every now and then. That way, the stories were passed on from hundreds of years ago. Sorry, there's a printing error here where the bottom line on this page is then reproduced again at the top line of that page. That threw me off for a second. And so there is I don't question that these stories are very, very ancient. But again, this is the interesting thing about oral tradition, is because it does undergo changes over time, it's also infinitely adaptable, right? So when you have a novel, for instance, yes, in subsequent reprintings, maybe the author makes changes, maybe an editor alters something, etc., etc. But the physical structure of the book itself is relatively permanent. But when you're dealing with oral traditions of storytelling, what you have is the ability of each individual storyteller to make alterations, to make additions, deletions, to make revisions to a story. And that's an incredibly powerful tool for conveying moral lessons because the needs of societies, the needs of groups of people alter over time, right? So what the Haudenosaunee needed culturally, what lessons they needed 500 years ago would be very different than the lessons that they need today, right? Pre-contact, pre-colonial, the pre-colonial world of the Haudenosaunee was a very different one than the world of 2025 with settler colonialism and capitalism, and largely the destruction of Haudenosaunee culture, and the severe constriction of those elements of Haudenosaunee culture that survive, unfortunately. The constriction is unfortunate, not the survival. The survival is awesome. I wish more Haudenosaunee culture still survived, was maintained, and still lived. But this is part of the thing, is that what moral lessons are needed at different times can be very flexible with an oral tradition, and that's part of the reason why this is such a good medium for achieving what the Haudenosaunee wanted to achieve. And there are sort of subsequent references to the antiquity of these tales, which of course establishes their longevity, their validity, and it gives them ethos in rhetorical terms, right? It gives them credibility because they are very old, and traditions are generally, in most cultures, regarded as being authoritative, right? So, for instance, at the end of the story, Greedy Fawn and the Magic Chestnut, Ha-yen-doh-nees, it says here, Ha-yen-doh-nees thought that the story of Greedy Fawn must be a very old story, because his father was about 80 years old then, and he had heard the story in his childhood. And so this is an interesting sort of thing, is on the one hand you are you're establishing the longevity of these stories as a mode of legitimizing them. But the fact that it is an oral tradition actually gives it tremendous flexibility. So it's really, in that sense, kind of a perfect medium for conveying moral lessons that are relevant to this particular moment, while not necessarily locking a culture, not pickling a culture, right? Not locking a culture into the moral lessons of the past if those moral lessons are no longer relevant. The other thing that I think is really, really cool, there's one other story I really want to talk about, which is how the mice kept the peace among the tribes. Because this story talks about indigenous sovereignty, which is something I'm really, really fascinated with. A lot of my scholarly work about First Nations, Native American, Inuit, and Métis drama primarily focuses on this question of indigenous sovereignty and indigenous political practices. And so how the mice kept the peace among the tribes is a really interesting one for that. So the first paragraph of this story says, "Mice have always lived near the habitation of man, and this was also true in the time before the coming of the white settlers to the lands of the Indians, when men, animals, and trees could speak to each other. The mice had their chiefs and council to govern themselves, and they lived in tribes among the Iroquois." So there's two things that I think are really striking here. In the times before the coming of the white settlers to the lands of the Indians, when men, animals, and trees could speak to each other. Again, this is a very traditional component of First Nations, Native American, Inuit, and Métis cultures, is this sort of transhuman idea of the moral and ethical legitimacy of all living beings, that we have reciprocal responsibilities to everything that exists within creation. But we also have this element: the mice had their chiefs and council to govern themselves, and they lived in tribes. So we have the description here of a democratic society, right? Because one of the things that's really, really cool about the Haudenosaunee and their political configuration is that it functioned in concentric circles. But these were not authoritative circles, right? In the way that, like, the president of the United States has probably more power than any other individual in the country, debatably with the exception of someone like Elon Musk, who's used his money to do massive, massive harm to the country. But you have the president, and then you have Congress, and then you have state governments, et cetera, et cetera. And so you have concentric circles of decreasing authority, and as you get further and further out from that center of power, subjects have less and less authority, till you get down to us, the people, who individually have very little control over anything in our actual society. In Haudenosaunee political organization, it was kind of the opposite, where you had individual clans, and those clans were directly democratic. So within those clans, under the supervision typically of matriarchs who functioned more like parliamentarians, I suppose, than like leaders necessarily. Like they made sure that things functioned properly according to the political ethos of the Haudenosaunee. But each clan would engage in direct democracy, and then from there they would send representatives to the larger tribal structure, and then from there the tribe would send representatives to the confederation, etc., etc. But each of those groups, each of those sort of increasing tiers of exclusivity, were responsive and responsible to those at the broader levels. And so we have here kind of a description of this multi-level I don't want to say disseminated, because that's not quite the right word, but this expansive approach to democracy, in which direct democracy is the foundation, and then at the sort of upper tiers of governance, those who are representing the people are responsible for representing them specifically. But we also have this very interesting element here. This young war chief gets up and says, and basically convinces the people. It says here, this young war chief had great influence among the young warriors, who greatly outnumbered the older chiefs and older warriors, and they called for a vote on whether or not to go to war. A vote was taken in which the young warriors all voted to go to war, and so it was decided to leave that very night as soon as the moon had risen. Now this, I think, is really, really cool. It overlaps really well with my actual area of interest here. In this case, the intersection of rhetoric and democracy, and there's almost something Herodotean about this, right? So in Herodotus, we get these instances where the Athenians make a massive mistake because they've been persuaded by the rhetoric of someone pushing them into making a bad decision. And Herodotus is very critical of this, but it's also a thing that recurs throughout the Peloponnesian Wars. And so that intersection between rhetoric and democracy and the possibilities of making a wrong decision, of being persuaded to make a wrong decision within a democratic system, I think are really, really interesting. And the fact that the Seneca have this story that engages with that, I think is really interesting on a level of how direct democracy can and should function within the Haudenosaunee worldview.